Dear colleagues and friends, this is Hui Kai, Head of Content Division at WuXi AppTech. On behalf of my colleagues around the world, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 5th episode of our Rare Disease webinar series, Collaborations That Transform. We launched this series about a year ago. Since then, we have explored together the challenges and opportunities in neurofibromatosis, hemophilia, SMA, and multiple sclerosis. And several weeks ago, we hosted our first virtual rare disease concert to amplify the voices and stories of the patients, families, and caregivers who are affected by rare disease. And today, on International Pompe Day, we're glad to be with you again. This year's International Pompe Day slogan is "Together We're Strong." It is in this spirit that I'm honored to kick off today's webinar. During today's discussions, you'll hear from physicians, drug developers, and patients of Pompe disease. Together, we'll not only raise international awareness of the disease, but also explore ongoing efforts for better treatment and care. Let's start with a conversation between Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief of BioCentury, and John Crowley, Chairman and CEO of Amicus Therapeutics. In 1992, two of John's children were diagnosed with Pompe disease. John has since been on a lifelong journey in finding cure for Pompe and other rare diseases. He's the inspiration for the movie Extraordinary Measures, and definitely an inspiration for us all. Please join me in welcoming John and Simone.
John, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. And I want to start the conversation with something you've said, which is that we know a lot about the biology of Pompe disease, but we still don't know what's the answer. So in your mind, what is the state of the art about the disease, and what do you see as the principal hurdles that are left to uncover?
Well, Simone, first of all, thank you for doing this. Pompe disease for many of us has been a journey. It's one that we never planned for in our lives, whether you're a patient or a family member. As we sit here today, we've come a long way, particularly in the last couple of decades, at really understanding the fundamental biology of the disease. We understand, of course, the buildup of glycogen. We understand a missing or defective protein. But what we've also come to realize is there are many hundreds of mutations that can lead to the defect in that same gene and the deficiency of that same enzyme and a buildup of that same substrate. But because of the uniqueness of the mutations, but also because of the uniqueness of our body, our anatomy, our genetics, it leads to vastly different outcomes. And as we know, we can see patients diagnosed at birth with severe infantile forms of the disease, all the way to I've met some patients in some cases out past 70 years of age before they get their Pompe diagnosis. So there is some core biology, and we understand it better than we ever have. And the challenge now is, how do we utilize that understanding of biology to make medicines, and to make medicines to stave off the effects of the disease, or ultimately to reverse what is a mistake of nature, to provide as much health and longevity to people as we can. So as we sit here today, we've got a pretty good understanding of the biology of Pompe disease. Not fully, there's still more that we need to learn, but really what we've been working on for quite a few years now, and what we'll continue to work on for at least the next decade or longer, until we finally truly have cures, particularly for newly diagnosed patients. We really need to understand, how do we apply that knowledge of medicine, or biology rather, to making medicines. And there, thankfully, we've got a lot of tools in our arsenal that we've never had before. Programs that we've never thought about, like gene editing, that till 8-9 years ago, nobody had ever thought of, all the way to gene therapy that's been in the mix for decades, but is finally starting to make some headway and progress, even just beginning clinical studies, and a whole range of other approaches that people have. So on one hand, it's still a very challenging disease. We still don't have cures. We need more treatments. We need more effective treatments across the board. And ultimately, I think we're going to get to a point where we've developed custom tailored approaches for each patient as an individual based on their genetics, their background, their severity of disease. So as customized an approach to personalized medicine as we can have. We're not there yet, but it's finally in the next decade or so, I think, hopefully with insights.
So a little bit later in the discussion, I want to come to the issue of the Pompe community, which is a very active one. But let's continue this thread that you've just talked about. And you've said again, you know, I love your quotes, Pompe is monogenic, but it's not monolithic. I want to talk a little bit, you mentioned gene therapy. So there are many emerging modalities now, new modalities, and many of these are being deployed in rare diseases. So can you expand a little bit on the intersection of these with Pompe disease and, you know, how they might play out, where you think that there's more hope for use of those new modalities?
Yeah, I think more and more we're realizing that a lot of these modalities that maybe weren't thought of in the context of Pompe disease may actually have some applications to help people living with Pompe. So we've been blessed in some regards in the Pompe community in that we were among the first to have the option of an enzyme replacement therapy. We hopefully have more enzyme replacement therapy options coming to patients. We've all been thinking about gene therapy for a long time. And I remember when our Megan and Patrick were diagnosed in 1998, I reached out to one of the world's leading researchers who had just published a paper on gene therapy. I asked a lot of questions, most of them probably pretty naive, but I did ask the question, when could it be in patients? And he said a year, maybe two. Well, it took more than 20 years to get to the point where we're just now beginning to treat patients in clinical studies. So, you know, continued work, continued promise on the gene therapy front. I think candidly, Pompe is a very complex disease for gene therapy. You've got all the issues that everybody is wrestling with still in terms of targeting, safety, efficacy, getting to all muscles of disease, manufacturability, ultimately cost, all of those issues. I think we probably have about a decade of work ahead of us as a field in gene therapy. But again, we're starting to see the very early promise of gene editing technologies broadly in biotechnology and specifically in Pompe, but other approaches, small molecules, what are known as antisense oligonucleotides. So great big science word that means that we may actually be able to intervene with a shot or a pill, with a whole new technology. And other new technologies that have been invented for other diseases that are now being looked at to be applied to Pompe, and others that are just now being invented. So again, I think we're finally on the cusp of this golden age of genetic medicine. And I think Pompe very much will be at the forefront. I see over and over again companies in their presentations, I see academics in their papers applying new technologies to Pompe. Where 10, 20 years ago, it was a very limited universe of researchers and companies. And I think that's terrific. Competition will bring innovation and it'll speed timelines. So I'm excited about a lot of things we're seeing. And I think ultimately it'll be very customized.
Let's talk about that for a minute, if we can. We often see multiple innovators working in the same rare disease, which actually might seem counterintuitive since there are so many rare diseases and each of them has so few patients. But there are really advantages of competition in a small patient population diseases. And maybe you could sort of spell out how these different innovators are pushing each other forward.
Sure. I think, competition is a good thing. We always view the disease as the competition. And the more horsepower we can bring to that, I think is a good thing. Ultimately, you're not going to have in Pompe or any rare diseases too many players. That will never be the case. If many technologies end up working, the best ones will leap to the forefront and they will be the most successful, and people will divert their resources, their capital elsewhere if Pompe becomes a satisfied patient population. We're not there yet. We're not even close. So in that regard, I think having multiple players is a great thing. I think in some areas we need to think about cooperating better. For instance, when we think about clinical trials, our natural history studies our registry studies. I think more and more we need to be open to sharing that data as tool sets for all innovators, everybody making medicines. And I think when we look too at the potential to share technologies, I think you'll start to see more and more of that. I think you'll end up seeing that it's, again, not going to be one size fits all. For years, we've had one option. Hopefully we'll have more soon. But over the next 5, 10, 15 years, I think we'll have many, many more. It'll be customized to people's individual mutations, their stage of disease. So at the front of all of that, we've got to have a lot of irons in the fire, because most of them aren't going to make it through. And hopefully those that do will make a profound difference for people.
So let's talk a little bit about the patient community. And I want to bracket this. The last major global public health catastrophe was AIDS. In many ways, that was the origin of patient advocacy, at least insofar as its impact on the biomedical industry or biomedical community. And patient advocates are now a major part of the bio-innovation ecosystem. So what have we learned along the way?
We've learned a lot, and we've been able to apply it in a way that will advance development. So, and it's a great example, Simone. You go back to the HIV activism of the late 80s, when HIV was the health scourge of the world, and drug development was moving very slowly. And the HIV community wouldn't stand for it. And I mean, the protests that happened, the calls for congressional action, the public awareness, it accelerated research and development. The first drug ever approved, AZT, for AIDS, a barely effective, highly toxic molecule that got approved on a surrogate marker endpoint. And it didn't cure AIDS, but what it did was open up the field to many, many innovators. You had a lot of players. In fact, back then, people said we have too many people involved in HIV. And we didn't. In fact, we probably didn't even have enough. But when you look at that model, over the next decade, more than 24 medicines became approved, to the point now where HIV is, by and large, an effectively managed chronic condition. And that happened. It really, the wellspring for that began with the patient community and their demands for not only safe and effective medicines, but that it be looked at through a benefit risk assessment through the patient's eyes. We, if you fast forward then, just about 4.5, 5 years ago, there was a major piece of legislation. It was the last major piece signed by President Obama, bipartisan legislation, the 21st Century Cures Act. And many pieces of that mandated bringing in the patient perspective. For instance, patient-focused drug development forums grew out of that time period. We just had one in Pompe last summer. Bringing the patient voice is critically important. It's not only good for the patient community to be informed, to know, to be able to shape development timelines and ultimately a choice of medicines. It makes the development programs better. Bringing, whenever we go to the FDA, we always bring a patient representative with any disease. And we begin every FDA meeting with 5 minutes with the patient perspective on whatever that topic may be. So I think it's a great thing. I think you're seeing more of it. And what I'm actually seeing now is a change in mindset across the industry, small companies and large, across academia, where it's always been welcome to have the patient perspective, but among regulators as well. We had a meeting with the agency probably about 1.5 years ago. We brought a Pompe patient representative, and she began the meeting, and she happened to be just sitting kind of behind the executives from our company in the front. And the lead medical reviewer at the FDA asked who she was, and she spoke up more. And she said, would you please step to the table? She said, we work for you. And I think that was great. And I think it was very genuine. And it brought just a different tone to that exchange. And I think elevated the patient perspective on a par with any medical or science perspective offered in that meeting. And I hope that's something that continues broadly.
So let's bracket the conversation with the current pandemic, hopefully soon to be over, but let's see how long that rolls.
Hopefully.
Are there lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic for Pompe disease or more broadly for rare diseases?
I think for both, actually. You look at some of the tools that were employed, you look at the frequent interactions, the risk-benefit assessment that was done through design of clinical studies, the constant feedback with regulators. I think there are some tool sets and examples we can use to make sure that we always develop, medicines by the gold standard that are safe and effective, but that also are developed with a great sense of urgency. And so I think maybe the greatest thing we can take away from the lessons of the COVID crisis that we could apply to development in Pompe or any rare disease is really a mindset. And you think about what was always underlying the development of vaccines over the last year. It was the notion, number one, we need vaccines that are safe and effective. Number two, we have to ensure 100% access, ultimately globally, to every person in the world. And number three was time. We knew we could make a vaccine, that this was a druggable target, if you will. We could make a vaccine. We knew we could beat this mistake of nature in COVID, but we needed to beat time. And so that sense of urgency became so great. If we can take that mindset, safe and effective medicines, access for all, and the notion that it's a race against time in every one of these diseases, especially a disease like Pompe, I think that will have long-lasting and positive effects on drug development broadly.
So, continuing this thread of the pandemic, we have seen, I have been fortunate to have a front row seat to some of this, the most extraordinary coming together of, I use the word competitors in its broadest sense, but different pharma companies, everybody really pulling together. And I think, I don't know if it's created a paradigm shift, but it certainly forged some new friends in the foxhole that we hope will continue in the post-pandemic era. Do you see alliances, new alliances coming out of this for rare diseases and for patient communities coming together? And I want to also ask you to put a global aspect on that. Do you see that? You talked about global access. So how much harder is that for patient communities in different countries?
It really varies. You look at the sophistication of some of the patient communities that have been developed here in the States and Europe and elsewhere, where they've had access to medicines in Pompe or other rare diseases. That's been incredibly helpful, and that's grown in its stature and level of helpfulness and respect. But I've seen it elsewhere too. I've been to China a couple of times. I've met with Pompe patients in China, Fabry patients, the Chinese Organization of Rare Diseases. I've been to the Middle East. I've been to Eastern Europe, Latin America, and you're seeing the same themes. They're just at a different stage of their development. So I think if we can increase patient awareness, patient advocacy broadly around the world, you will start to continue to see the interconnectedness of these organizations. We're, I think, in an advantaged spot with great leadership in the IPA, in the International Pompe Association. And in fact, in some respects, the Pompe community globally is a real example for a lot of other rare diseases. So you will see much more of that, I think, ahead. You'll also see it among regulators. There is a mechanism now, at least for the US and the European Medicines Agency, to coordinate on rare disease programs. I know they're doing it in Pompe disease now. And I think that's a good thing to reduce the timelines, to reduce inefficiencies, make sure you don't have two different studies for development of a medicine, different endpoints, try to harmonize that as best we can. Anything that strengthens development, anything that shortens timelines for access to medicine, I think is a great thing. Years ago when our kids were diagnosed, I kind of had this dream that I would take all the smartest Pompe experts in the world and kind of lock them in a room and tell them you couldn't come out until you figured it out together. Well, we didn't do that, but from time to time, we've had a chance to be very well connected as a community. And we are blessed as well, having such knowledgeable and candidly passionate experts in the field. The doctors who are willing to work hard, to always put patients' interests first, to work with a range of new technologies. That gone are the days where doctors would only work with one company. Those days are gone. And that, I think, is a good thing. So hopefully we'll see more and more collaboration But again, the notion of competition, I think, is a good thing to make sure that everybody's sharp. Everybody's always developing the best medicines. I've always believed that if you can make the best medicines and get them to as many people as quickly as possible, you will build a great and lasting company. And we have room for many great and lasting companies in the rare disease field and even within Pompe disease.
John, let's finish on a personal note. You've certainly been a force to be reckoned with in this disease, and I think more broadly in rare diseases. Tell us where your children, your family are now, and how you view your mission going forward.
You know, the kids are great today. As we all know, Pompe disease, as much as it devastates muscles of people living with Pompe, it doesn't affect the mind. And the kids have been blessed to be incredibly smart and precocious. I look at our younger son, Patrick is now 23 years old. Patrick just turned 23, and he finished public high school here, did some post-high school education, and he now works in a flower shop. He has a part-time job in a flower shop in Princeton. It is hard for Patrick. He's very profoundly affected by the disease. But he wants to live as deep and fulfilling a life as he can and to give back to others. And then our Megan, as many of you know, went off to college in 2015, 600 miles from our home in Princeton, New Jersey. Megan went to the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. She finished in 4 years with a double major, spent every one of her 4 years every night in a dorm room at Notre Dame. She then moved down to North Carolina, and Megan began studies in the School of Social Work. Megan is pursuing a master's in social work degree at the University of North Carolina. She'll complete that this spring. Obviously, during COVID, it's been remote. And Megan hopes to work with rare disease families as a social worker. Our vision continues to be a big one. For our family, it's to live as long and healthy and happy lives as we can. I've always told our kids, I just want you to be happy, safe, and fulfilled. And I think that's kind of what every parent wishes for their child, whether they live with a muscle disease or whatever challenge they may have. And we all have challenges at different times and to different degrees. And, our vision for the field is one where looking out to the future where many of these diseases, including Pompe, are quickly diagnosed and very effectively treated. And I hope someday a disease like Pompe, effectively what we're doing with these technologies, Simone, is we're accelerating what would happen through hundreds or thousands of years of human evolution to really extend and enhance people's lives. And that's what I hope that a decade, 2 decades from now, that in Pompe disease, a child is born, quickly diagnosed, whether they would be symptomatic immediately or decades from then, the parents sit down and with the physician, and the doctor says, your child has an enzyme deficiency, but we have a cure, and here's the plan. That's a very different world than most of us have known our whole lives here. So that's the hope, and it's one that we can finally begin to see come to fruition, still with a lot of work ahead of us. So.
Well, thank you very much. It's certainly an inspirational vision. I think it's true not only for Pompe and rare diseases, but all diseases that we can actually have that vision. So thank you, John. Thank you for your advocacy and your work in that field as well.
Thank you. All right. Be well. Thank you. God bless.
Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the second panel of today's webinar on Pompe disease. The session is entitled Closing the Gap in Pompe Disease, Where Are We Heading? My name is Rich Saul, and I'm of Wuxi AppTech. I'm very pleased to be moderating the session with my colleagues here. And with me today is two leading experts in the field of Pompe disease, Dr. Priya Sunil Krishnani, the CL and Suchen Professor of Pediatrics, the Division Chief of the Medical Genetics at Duke University Medical Center, Jordi Diaz-Manera, Professor of Neuromuscular Disorders, Translational Medicine, Genetics, the Honorary Consultant in Clinical Genetics at Newcastle University. And joining us today are two Pompe patients, both of whom represent patient advocacy organizations. Tiffany House, Chairman and Board Member of the International Pompe Association, and Brad Crittenden, Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Pompe. So in today's discussion, I'd like to cover several points. The first being demystify for our audience, take a high-level view of Pompe disease for that audience. Secondly, look at the evolving roles of patients and patient advocacy in Pompe disease. Explore opportunities for better diagnosis and treatments, how technology may impact partnerships, and also bridge future gaps. And then finally, examine or explore future outlooks and directions. So as we begin, I'd like to have Priya and Jordi discuss first the state of the disease today. Well, Priya will go first, and regarding the education of our audience, can highlight some of the key features of the disease and what makes it so challenging, and tell us about the state of the care from a physician's perspective.
Sure. Thank you, Richard, for the kind introduction. And this is truly a very wonderful time in the field of Pompe disease. A lot has evolved from its original description to where we are today. Definitely would like to first clarify the nomenclature. Pompe disease in the original description was really primarily for those with the infantile form of the disease with significant cardiac involvement. Today, Pompe disease encompasses the entire spectrum of patients who have acid alpha-glucosidase enzyme deficiency or GAA enzyme deficiency, which when deficient results in an accumulation of lysosomal glycogen and the protein manifestations as we see it today in individuals with Pompe disease. So coming back to the definition of what is Pompe disease, as you asked, it encompasses a spectrum from the infantile at one extreme to patients that can present in the 5th or even 6th decade of life, what is known as late onset Pompe disease. So for further clarification, broadly, Pompe disease is classified into infantile onset Pompe disease and late onset Pompe disease. I'm going to try and focus some on infantile Pompe disease. So these are babies who have cardiac muscle hypertrophy or cardiomyopathy, which often is present right at birth, even before birth if an ultrasound is done. But often when the baby is diagnosed is the point at which the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is noted on echocardiogram or on chest x-ray. So this presence of cardiomyopathy is the distinguishing feature between infantile onset Pompe disease and late onset Pompe disease.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, Jordi, can you tell us a little bit more about the late onset and some of the unique challenges in terms of either diagnosis, treatments, and then cure possibilities, right? Care, and care as well. Yes.
Yes, of course. So as Priya was just saying, late onset Pompe disease affects patients that can present at almost different ages, from pediatric patients to adult patients. So the typical case with late onset Pompe disease would be a patient that is between 30 and 40 years old that will develop a slowly progressive muscle weakness affecting first the pelvic muscles and also the axial muscles, so muscles of the spine and also abdominal muscles. And these patients are also going to develop more or less degree of respiratory involvement. But this is the typical clinical picture. It's true that we can also see patients that start younger. So for example, during the adolescence, and then you can have patients that have a predominant axial involvement with scoliosis, This is the typical one. And then we can also have patients that have only an onset of the disease late in life when they are 60, and then they have a mild involvement of the pelvic muscles. So although most of the patients follow a typical pattern of involvement, it's true that there are variants and there are different streams of the disease. You were asking about challenges. In the case of late onset Pompe disease, for me, there are several challenges. Probably one of the most important is the diagnosis. This remains a challenge nowadays because most of these patients are going to develop slowly progressive symptoms that sometimes are not even noticed by the patients. So when they present to the doctors, they are already weak and sometimes are confounded with other limb-girdle muscular dystrophies or other causes of myopathies, and take some time to make the diagnosis. So I would say, and probably Priya will agree with me, that the disease is not difficult to diagnose once you think on Pompe. So if you think that the patient that you are facing can have a Pompe disease, it's not a difficult to diagnose disease. The main issue is that it's a rare disease, and this means that not everybody is aware of the disease, and some cases can be missed. So that's one of the challenges. And in terms of treatment, as Priya was saying, I agree with her, we are living a good moment because we have already a treatment that is available for patients with Pompe, two treatments that have just finished successfully clinical trials, and they are going to be available in the next years. And we have a lot of research in terms of gene therapy and clinical trials that are now ongoing with these new treatments and new approach. So I think that although it's true that there are some limitations in the treatment that we have at present, the future is good because we have these new treatments coming.
Yeah, if I could just add, Richard, to what Jordi said, it's the diagnosis is actually so simple today as compared to what it was in 2006, when we were all working towards a treatment, a definitive treatment in terms of enzyme treatment for Pompe disease. Prior to 2006, patients were diagnosed if they could get a skin biopsy done, and then that skin had to be grown up, to what we call skin fibroblasts, sent to a tertiary care laboratory, which has expertise in doing it. So that's 6 weeks already from the time a skin biopsy is done to by the time it's grown up and sent to the laboratory, and then you get a result, or it was done via muscle biopsy. And then, with complete tribute to Dr. Chamolis from Argentina, a dried blood spot assay was developed for Pompe disease, and that really has revolutionized the ability to diagnose patients very quickly with a turnaround of 1 to 2 days from once the dried blood spot is obtained and can be done. In fact, that's what's being used today in the arena of newborn screening, taking advantage of that dried blood spot assay technology. So it's just having the physicians, that's each one of us, think about Pompe disease in our differential, and then, the actual diagnosis does not take time at this time.
Yeah. We often get questions on diagnosis, and I know on the U.S. side, Priya, we work with you very closely when patients have difficulty getting a diagnostic test done. Do you think there is ever a reason today to do a muscle biopsy beyond informational? I mean, should it be used for diagnostic purposes, especially in the case of confirmation after a newborn screen?
Absolutely. So I think Jordi, as a neuromuscular physician, will agree with me that there is a role for muscle biopsy, but I don't think that role is for diagnosis, because in fact, if a muscle biopsy is done and we're basing the results like histology findings, we often miss a diagnosis of Pompe disease. And there are several patients that I follow at our institution at Duke that were initially missed based on a muscle biopsy. Now, if the muscle biopsy is being used to further understand disease pathology and pathophysiology and mechanisms, absolutely, I think there is a role for muscle biopsy, but not purely for diagnosis. So it's a very good point, Tiffany. And maybe we should ask you, how was your diagnosis made? And also, Brad, how was your diagnosis made? Sorry, Rich, but I just think for the audience to know the journey that our wonderful patient advocates have been through themselves.
I think mine was made by muscle biopsy and then confirmed with skin biopsy. However, to your point, and to Jordy's, by the time I was diagnosed, my breathing was like 50% of normal, and I was quite severely affected. So I think the issue of not finding it through the pathophysiology, that was not an issue. It was very clear that the muscle was affected. So it was picked up through the muscle and then actually confirmed it through a skin biopsy.
Yeah, I had so many tests done during my diagnostic time that really it all added up to the diagnosis. But I think that the real confirming test was the muscle biopsy. There were a number of things, like I had high liver enzymes and my CK was quite high. There's a lot of things that kind of pointed in that direction, but I really think it was the muscle biopsy.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for your comments and thoughts. One question I have is it's a monogenic disease, but there's a lot of mutations that occur on that gene that give rise to the disease. Is there any kind of association between the mutation which is found versus the severity of disease?
It's a very polymorphic gene, and there are mutations that are scattered throughout the gene. And there's new mutations and new pathogenic variants, as if we were to use appropriate nomenclature today, that are being uncovered, especially because of newborn screening. And so it's very rare that you find a patient with the same combination of pathogenic variants. So for the infantile form, it's a combination of two deleterious mutations. And there is a very rich database, out of the Netherlands that can be looked at also to find out of the available mutations or pathogenic variants that have been published on. And so they continue to catalog and update it. There are also many in the US now that are being done that continue to catalog these pathogenic variants. For the late onset mutations, at least if we take a very US and Europe-centric approach, about 60 to 90% of adults with Pompe disease or with late onset Pompe disease have what we call the leaky IVS splice site mutation. But if you think of the rest of the world outside of US, so outside of people of Caucasian descent, they don't have that IVS splice site mutation, and they have a combination of other mutations which could give them a late onset phenotype. So yes, there is some genotype to phenotype understanding, but being a geneticist, I always think of it now, we are in an omics world, and there are so many additional factors, even within the Pompe gene, but outside the gene, that can modify the phenotype of an individual. And I'll let Dr. Manera also add to this.
No, thank you, Priya. I think that you have explained this perfectly fine. So it's true that we have several new mutations every year that have been discovered. So the number of mutations in the gene are just increasing and increasing. For example, we have just done a study in Spain collecting 100 patients, and we have identified 20 new mutations that are affecting families sometimes. You have just two mutations that are in that family and have not been described before that. So that is not uncommon in this gene. We don't really know why there are genes that are so susceptible to have many mutations, and there are others where this is more rare. But in the case of Pompe, the GAA gene is highly susceptible to be mutated and to develop a variant that can lead to disease.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'd like to move to the role of patient advocates and advocacy. I'd like to address this next set of questions to Brad and Tiffany. And you're both a patient and you're a leader in patient advocacy. So what have been some of the initiatives that you've undertaken and how they've helped in making a difference for patients? How has it been impactful for them? And also, what have you done in terms of patient care? So let me ask, I'll go to Brad first, and then we'll go to Tiffany.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. When I think about our activities, whether I'm looking at things that we've done or things that we're planning to do, I always go back and take a look at two of the terms in our mission statement. We don't often look at our mission statements, right? But I really try to do that. And they're education and community. So we take our responsibility for education quite seriously, but there are a lot of different ways to do that. And one of the ways that we have now that we didn't used to have is social media. Social media isn't just people posting pictures of what they had for dinner last night. Pompe patients do that too. But really, it provides us with a lot of opportunity that we didn't have before. We can post an article on our website and get it out on social media to reach really the world community, not just the community in Canada. So we can do that. We can share campaigns between organizations to try to build awareness. That's all good, but it's really important for us as well to participate in the conversation that's happening. There's some very active groups on Facebook that seems to be the most active for Pompe disease, up to thousands of people. So these are quite big groups, and it's a way for us to get out there and be in touch with the community. It's a way for us to gauge what is important to our families. We may think something's important and we might be wrong, right? We should always be willing to listen. So that's very important. When I think about community, I think one thing that we sometimes take for granted is that I think most of our organizations do patient meetings where patients and families have an opportunity to get together face to face. And we maybe don't always appreciate how important that is. Like, that is so important. I know when I was diagnosed, it was years before I saw another Pompe patient. And it's the same thing for a lot of us. Now we have social media, so we're able to reach out and connect where we couldn't before. But it's not the same as face-to-face.
Thank you, Brad. Tiffany, let's add into that, please.
Sure. Yeah, I think I have two hats that I wear. On the one hand, there's the national hat with the U.S. organization, and then I have my international hat. But I think, to Brad's point, the Pompe community is truly an international community. And I think that is something that through my advocacy work, I have continuously stressed in just about every conversation I have. Nothing happens in a bubble in the Pompe community. And I think that the advent of social media, honestly, though, it started back in the late 90s. There was a listserv for Pompe patients that had hundreds of patients on it. And from there, that grew into the different Facebook groups. But the community has always been very active and involved in sharing information, asking questions, sharing stories. And we also have a fantastic relationship with the medical and scientific community that collaborate with us and share with us. So, yeah, I think the main things for patient advocacy that are the most important are creating awareness, supporting patients, and learning more about the disease. It always strikes me that there is so much we still don't know about Pompe. To Priya's point earlier, why is it that two patients with identical mutations can have such very different outcomes? Why is it that two siblings can have very different outcomes? And we don't know the answers. So I love that we're still learning and still working, and I think that those are some of the most important things that we need to continue doing.
Okay. Question back to Brad for a moment. As a patient advocate, what do you see as some of your biggest challenges? And let me ask you, the subset of that, is it only limited to patients, or do you have easy access to physicians, and are they equipped to really handle rare diseases such as Pompe? And the last part of that question would be, how is your patient organization addressing these gaps that may exist? Start with Brad first. Yeah.
Thanks, Rich. Because we have a pretty small number of patients in Canada, we've got between 60 and 65 diagnosed, a lot probably not diagnosed, but diagnosed, we have about 60 to 65 patients in Canada. So we don't have a huge barrier when it comes to communication. I really think one of our biggest challenges is that, you know, it's not only in our country, but I'm sure in most countries, we've got large centers where we have clinicians that have an opportunity to get a lot of experience, not just with Pompe disease, but many diseases. And they see a number of patients and patients with diseases that are similar. So it builds up that expertise, and that's really important. Where in smaller centers, you know, the physicians, they just don't have access to that. They don't see the patients, the number of patients. You know, I can remember talking to one, and he said, you know, all I remember about Pompe disease was just a little bit I read in a book when I was in med school, and I can't actually remember it coming up again. I mean, it was taught in more general terms, I guess. But it's just because they don't have that opportunity. You know, in bigger centers, you have a chance to, you know, be involved in clinical trials and different studies and research programs that a lot of these physicians just don't have a chance to do. So I think there's an opportunity for organizations like ours. Now, we don't have access to this group of doctors or clinicians, but we can partner with organizations that do, and we can bring patient experience to that, which I think can go a long way in helping them understand the disease. And I think it'd be very interesting, actually. I think they find it very interesting because everybody wants to diagnose patients quicker. Everybody wants to.
Thank you. Tiffany, you have a unique perspective because you're involved both, let's say, domestically as well as internationally. And what have you seen to some of the challenges and along those lines, are you making in your estimation, making progress between, you know, this domestic versus international boundaries?
Yeah, the domestic is very similar to what Vlad was saying. You know, there are ways to communicate with patients. I think the hardest thing that I find is when patients don't come to you for help, and you find out about something and you think, if you just come to me, we could have helped pave the, you know, path for you. There are resources that we have. There are relationships we have where we can help get the correct information into the hands of patients. And that is critically important because, as Brad said, if you are lucky enough to live right next to an expert center, you should be great. If you live near Duke or anywhere that has an expert center, you're fine. You have that access to treatment and experts and advice. However, if you don't, you're at the hands of a physician that may have never heard of Pompe, maybe reading it in a textbook. And so it's a matter of getting the right combination of physicians that are willing to learn, physicians that are willing to collaborate, and patients that are willing to advocate for themselves. On the international side, I think we look at the big picture. Each country has their own issues, but it's always a matter of fighting to make sure that everybody has equality of information and trying to advocate for equality of access to treatment and care. And those are challenges because each country has its own regulatory scheme, its own reimbursement scheme. And so I think that that's something we're doing to continue facing in the years to come.
Okay, thank you so much, Tiffany. Let's go back to opportunities for better diagnosis and treatment. So let's start with Priya. So what do you see as some of the challenges then in terms of diagnosis and treatment from your perspective?
So in terms of challenges to diagnosis, Rich, I think we touched upon this. It's more thinking about the diagnosis and doing it. The second challenge to diagnosis, I would definitely point this out, is that there is something what's called a pseudodeficiency allele. So that results in a decrease in enzyme activity, but that's in vitro, so outside the body, but it's not really impacting or causing disease. So I have been a very strong proponent from the outset that we need to do confirmatory testing through sequencing of the gene to ensure, by at least now 2 methods, right? You've got a low enzyme activity, you've got a patient that looks like they have Pompe disease, but now you're also doing sequencing or mutation analysis to get that confirmation. And then, you could move forward with different treatment approaches as they are indicated. They are definitely getting there, but if there is a large deletion, so to say, in the gene, and if you don't design, the way the sequencing is done, you could miss some of these. So these are just some barriers that I think we take it for granted in the developed world that this can be ordered, but sometimes this does remain a challenge in other parts of the world. And in terms of treatment, there is definitely a therapy, which is FDA and EMA approved, that is life-saving, has changed the course of babies with Pompe disease, has stabilized and improved many of the adults or, children with the late onset forms of the disease that have ended up on treatment. The challenge really is access to that treatment and, how do we make sure that patients can get the treatment even after diagnosis is made. Cost remains a huge barrier. And then also access to a facility or a provider that can do an intravenous treatment because it takes 3.5 hours, in addition to the time that's taken to mix up the drug, formulate it, and then provide it to the patient.
Yeah, thank you, Priya. So I agree with all what you said. Is in my opinion, the molecular diagnosis is needed. In all the cases, it's very important to confirm that you have 2 mutations in the genes. It can happen sometimes. This is rare, but in 2, 3, 5%, we don't really know how many patients do we have. The mutations are hidden, are more difficult to identify. And in these very specific cases, you have biochemical confirmation, and it's going to be a little bit longer to have a genetic confirmation because you need to do other techniques rather than just Sanger sequencing. This could be more complicated, and this can be one of the challenges sometimes. As I said, this remains a rare situation, but it's true that can happen, and then we need to know that. In terms of the access to treatment is what Priya was saying. So I think that we have a treatment. This treatment works. We can be more or less happy with the outcome of patients that are under treatment. Of course, it's a treatment that saves lives in case of infantile onset Pompe disease patients. In terms of the adults, we would like to have a treatment that is able to do a little bit more, of course. But the reality, and I think that this remains one of the main challenges, is that especially with adults, when patients arrive to the clinics, it's sometimes too late and they have lost a lot of muscle. So it's true that the treatment stabilizes the remaining muscle, but it's not recovering the muscle that is lost. So if we see a patient that is already in a wheelchair and needs respiratory support, the treatment will keep that patient that way, but it's not going to improve the situation too much. So this, unfortunately, is something that is not going to be solved with gene therapies, probably, because the muscle lost is gone. So we need to work considerably in order to increase awareness of the disease and be sure that these patients are diagnosed earlier.
Thank you so much. Why don't we move on to technology and partnership? And Brad, we'll direct this towards Brad and Tiffany. If from your eyes, in your angles, how has technology played a role in education, collaboration, and also, I think you touched upon this a little bit earlier, dissemination of proper information, or getting rid of the getting, addressing misinformation that's out there. Let's go with Tiffany first, please.
Well, I think that technology has absolutely made our community a very strong international community. As I said earlier, nothing happens in a bubble. And what we, at the international level, at the IPA, constantly advocate is if a company or a research group or anybody is going to put out information, you need to be aware that it's going to go beyond the country you release it in. And so if it's a matter of sending out information about a clinical trial only available in country X, that's fine, but be very black and white in your communication so that you don't have too many questions as follow-up. So I think just an awareness of how international our community is and how interconnected it is incredibly important. In terms of misinformation and all of that, I think it's something that we all struggle with and do the best we can at addressing it when we see it. The difficulty is with social, in the old days when there was the listserv and it was one place where everybody got information, it was much easier to monitor. Now with there being, 10, 20 plus groups and places that people post, it becomes more and more challenging on the patient advocacy side to monitor everything. So it's a matter of relying on each other to be on the lookout as well and correcting incorrect information as you see it and pointing people to each other's websites and to the experts to get the correct information.
Brad, would you like to comment further?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Tiffany said. I think there's, with opportunities come costs and overhead. It takes a lot of time to keep on top of all of these tools that we have out there now. I thought I'd share with you one thing that we've done, or we're doing actually right now, is we're partnering with a company who is developing an app to help patients manage their health data, and doing that in a way that they actually have control of their own data, and in a central place where they can manage it, they can share it with whoever they want to share it with, which could be a new doctor. It could be sharing it through into a clinical trial, a lot of different ways, but they have control of their data. I think there's going to be a lot of other technical opportunities that we have over time that have to do with data, and that's one type of information that isn't the same as when we're talking about social media. So I think we have to kind of keep our eyes open for all the different opportunities. There's so many different technical things that are really cool and make a difference to patients.
That's a nice segue for the last set of questions for Priya and Jordi, Ed, related to technology. Are there particular technologies? It could be diagnosis, it could be a treatment, it could be a treatment both pharmacological or non-pharmacological, or technology such as Brad was just discussing. Is there something on the horizon that could either shift the paradigm of diagnosis and treatment and care for patients? And would it be what might be transformative versus incremental in what you see? Now, I guess I'll ask Jordi to go first, please.
Okay, no problem. So from my point of view, thank you very much for asking me this, because I have spent part of my career working on MRI. So, and the application of muscle MRI to diagnosis and follow-up of patients with different neuromuscular diseases, including Pompe disease. And obviously the technology that has been developed in this field is helping in both aspects of the disease. So just talking a little bit about recent developments, I think that nowadays we have different sequences that can allow us to identify the muscle that is lost and is replaced by fat, and we can follow fat over time. And we have shown that this could be a good outcome measure to follow patients, follow the progression of patients over time. But not only that, there are other sequences that allow us, for example, to identify the presence of water. And we know that when there is glycogen in the muscle, this glycogen retains water, and this can be detected as well. And so MRI can be used to identify progressive accumulation of glycogen in the muscles indirectly through the accumulation of water, or more recently, also directly through with new sequences that allow the direct identification and quantification of glycogen. So from a technological point of view, I would say that muscle MRI is becoming something really interesting in terms of definition of the disease, diagnosis, follow-up, response to treatment, etc. I can say that there are other many different technological advances that can be useful for follow patients as outcome measures. So we now have accelerometers, for example, that can allow us to measure the distance that a patient walk. Not only that, now we have really cool devices that can identify angles of joints, height and length of a step, velocity, acceleration, so many different things, just using a small sensor that can be put, for example, in the spine. So we have more information for sure. And I think that Priya is involved in new clinical trials with recent advances, and probably she can talk better than me about all these new studies that are arriving to the field.
Priya, please.
Thank you so much. So I agree with Jordi, with better diagnostic or better tools to follow the muscle disease rather than the indirect measures. And so muscle MRI definitely, muscle ultrasound, in the developing world would also be helpful. But as a geneticist, also what's really exciting is the exome sequencing and genome sequencing, which is now available, which allows patients to be picked up, just because of untargeted look at the known genes to identify patients who may just present with the limb girdle dystrophy. So I think that has also been a game changer, and now I get many referrals based on that rather than the gene by gene kind of search that's going on. In terms of treatment strategies, there are next generation enzyme treatments which are currently in or have completed phase 3 clinical trials. And I think, the data in the two that have completed phase 3 trials are both promising in the sense that, would benefit some of the patients with Pompe disease, or at minimum is giving them a choice, right? That there's not just one treatment that's available. They have a choice now of 3 enzyme treatments that could benefit them, and an ability to maybe change from one to another based on how they're doing on a current version of the enzyme. Looking ahead, I really believe gene therapy is a reality for us with multiple groups that are working on AAV gene therapy, on lentiviral approaches to gene therapy. So just different approaches of providing the missing gene to the system. There's gene editing that's going on. There's small molecule approaches, and there's also what we call antisense oligonucleotides as another approach. So I didn't once think in my lifetime I would be seeing this kind of choice for patients with Pompe disease. It's just been a remarkable journey. And I think for every patient that I see, whether it's a child or an adult, I always tell them, stay the healthiest that you can, because the field is wide open and the opportunities are there. So
do you think there's roles for thank you. Do you think there's roles for regenerative medicine? And that came up in the course of our prep session, I recall, particularly from Tiffany. So, Tiffany, what would be your dream here in terms of, therapies on the horizon? Well, I don't know if they're on the horizon, but let's say that could be possible one day. Tiffany, would you like to make a comment?
Sure, absolutely. I think definitely regenerative medicine is something that if you ask most patients, we're interested in. And I think most of the medical community would be interested in offering it. And it really goes beyond Pompe to many, many, many diseases. Because for future patients, you have the hope of newborn screening, catching patients early. In the ideal world, everybody's picked up, starts treatment at the absolute correct time. There's the correct treatment, and they never have a symptom of Pompe. But that's the ideal world. And we know we're not living in that world. So for many of us, we live in a world where we were picked up late. Treatment was started late, either there wasn't a treatment or other things got in the way. And so the ability to reclaim lost muscle, because we mentioned current treatments, whether it be enzyme replacement therapy, gene therapy, if the muscle is gone, it's gone right now. So an option that brings back what you've lost, I think, is absolutely of interest, and something we all are hoping to see in the future.
Oh, thank you. So I'd like to just wrap up, and we'll start with Priya, and then go to Jordy, and then we'll come back to our patients at the end of the day. So Priya, please, any thoughts on what the future might look like for you as a physician treating and diagnosing Pompe patients?
Well, I think that future is now for me. Exactly as Stephanie said, I am seeing patients identified by newborn screening. I am able to intervene. I am able to counsel families, and I'm already seeing that now in and it's just been phenomenal to be able to treat at, say, 6 months of age rather than a diagnostic journey of 15 years or 20 years, and seeing remarkable outcomes in the patients that have initiated treatment early.
Thank you. Jordy?
So my wish for the future would be that this reality would be for everybody in this world, that we can have and provide access to this newborn screening and treatments for everybody, regardless of where they live. That would be really great. And it's more a wish than what I think is going to happen in the future, but hopefully this someday is going to be a reality for everybody.
Brad?
I hope that we see universal newborn screening everywhere. I think it's going to be a huge, huge difference. But of course, that's only for the patients diagnosed now. There's a lot that they're already born. So quicker diagnosis, that'll make a huge difference as well. I'm confident that there's so many wonderful minds working on new treatments and therapies that's all going to happen. We all want it to happen faster, but I'm quite encouraged how quickly things are going. So it's awesome.
Thank you, Brad. Tiffany?
Well, I think everybody has basically, shared what I would share. So what I'd like to say is my hope for the future is we continue, as we have been doing for the last 25 years, by collaborating, by working together. And this is going to air on International Pompe Day. And our slogan is, "Together we are strong." And I think that if nothing else, our community has really proven that by collaborating, by talking, by learning from each other, and by working together day after day, year after year, even decade after decade. And that's my hope, that we continue doing that in the decades to come.
Well, thank you. I want to thank...
I could just add one thing. I think our true heroes
yes.
are really Brad and Tiffany. And so I just want to acknowledge that we are where we are. It's only because of this community and the direct, open line of communication that we have with the patient community.
Thank you, Priya. I want to thank Priya, Jordy, and of course I want to thank our patients and patient advocates, Brad and Tiffany, for your participation, and certainly the people who are viewing this session today on April 15th of National Pompe Awareness Day, International Pompe Awareness Day. And so I want to thank all of you for joining us and for spending time with your thoughts to all of our participants here on the panel discussion and to those who are viewing the session as well. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
I'm David Chen, the WuXi Advanced Therapy CEO. It's my great pleasure and honor to host and moderating the panel discussion session, Realizing the Promise of the Gene Therapy in Pompe Disease. It's my great honor to introducing three distinguished panelists to join this panel discussion. Dr. Barry Byrne, Associate Chair at the Pediatric and the Director of the PAL Gene Therapy Center at the University of Florida, and also the founder of Aventi Bio. The second panelist, Dr. Edward Connor, is Astellas Gene Therapy Site Head and the Division Head of Gene Therapy Medical and Development. And the third panelist is Jeff McKay, is a founder, president, and the CEO of Avero Bio. Let me get into the discussion right away. Maybe my first question I can direct to Barry. So Barry, what has been a main limitation of the enzyme replacement therapy, either the first and the second generation? Also, in your opinion, why is a gene therapy ideally suitable for the treatment of Pompe disease?
Well, thanks, David. I'm glad to be here and really enjoy visiting this afternoon with both Jeff and Ed. So I think this will be a lively and informative discussion. We began work in this area almost 20 years ago because of the unique circumstances of early onset Pompe disease that I began to see as a cardiologist, where the presentation of these patients was so challenging to manage. One of the most severe forms of early onset cardiomyopathy that we see in clinical practice. and certainly enzyme replacement therapy has been transformative for that particular aspect of the disease, because the exposure of recombinant proteins to the vasculature and to the heart assures reasonable amount of the proteins delivered into cardiomyocytes. What we began to see, though, in both patient populations and in the models that we had established of Pompe, is that there are manifestations that are not easily addressed through peripheral administration of recombinant proteins, because as a 110 kilodalton protein, this is not transported across the blood-brain barrier, and the same cellular effects of glycogen accumulation in the musculature, including the heart, are seen within neurons, and so those impact the neuronal function and ultimately their neuronal survival. And even in the long-term treated population, we see many manifestations of this in terms of facial weakness, respiratory insufficiency, inability to sit independently and walk in some of those patients. So that's what encouraged us to continue to pursue additional treatments to meet that unmet need in the patient population using this now technology that is become more pervasive in the variety of conditions that are genetically defined. So that's what we're focusing on in particular in the work we've been doing.
Great. But do you think that gene therapy can really addressing the fundamental root cause of the Pompe disease?
Yeah, conveniently, the alpha glucosidase gene is entirely incorporated into the AAV vector in a way that various control elements can be used to facilitate expression in a variety of tissue beds. So obviously, there's the potential to have a version of enzyme replacement therapy where continuous expression from the hepatic depot of expressing cells is one option, or what is, at least nature told us, is most efficient, is to have the delivery and processing of the protein from a cell autonomous route. So that requires that the vector genome enter each cell that may need to have a correction of alpha glucosidase activity. And in that way, very low amounts are actually needed because the whole system was evolved to very efficiently traffic the protein from the Golgi to the lysosome. So.
Great, thank you, Barry. Thank you so much. Maybe I can direct a similar question to Ed. So Ed, so what might be gene therapy address the limitation on the ERT, those current traditional treatment?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Barry said. With regards to ERT, it really has been transformational for the lives of patients, not just for Pompe, but for a whole host of rare diseases. I think one of the challenges, as Barry pointed out, is its ability to get into the cell. And so typically what's done is to give large amounts in the hope that you're creating gradients, because the receptor that brings it into the cell is a relatively low affinity receptor. So just as Barry pointed out, the two options are to produce steady and consistent levels, whether that's through liver-directed gene therapy, whether it's through the approaches that AVROBIO is taking, or to direct it to the tissue of interest itself. And that's the approach that we're taking, is we're utilizing an AAV viral vector that we know well. We know which tissues it goes to. We know what the viral transduction, how it gets its genetic contents into the cell. And we have experience understanding how does the mouse model translate to the non-human primate or monkey model, and ultimately translate to humans itself. And so that's where I think gene therapy, as Barry said, can provide real advantages because it should be able to get more of the enzyme into the cells that need to express it.
Great. Maybe I'd even go deeper for using the gene therapy to treat the Pompe disease. So which population of the Pompe disease patient were expecting have the bigger, better benefit? For example, the early versus late, intramuscular, central nervous system?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it really depends on the construct and how you design it. Barry mentioned a lot of the central nervous system involvement that's present in the early onset patients. And so, some gene therapies or some viral vectors, for example, have the ability to cross the blood-brain barrier. Others do not. And then the promoters that you use to drive expression will also affect where you're expressing GAA. I think one of the limitations that everyone's aware of for gene therapy is understanding how those viral vectors, which tissues they get to, which cells they get to, and how that may ultimately affect what it is that you're able to improve with regards to the disease pathogenesis. So to answer your question, for example, we're looking at muscle-directed AAV, and we're starting with late onset Pompe disease patients in an effort, again, to drive expression within the muscle. I think one of the open questions is, will there need to be different constructs to address different aspects of the disease. And then how broadly can you have that expression occur, and how broadly can you transduce those cells, as Barry was talking about earlier, so that you can get either direct cellular expression, or again, you can have enough steady and consistent levels of the enzyme that it can ultimately have a stronger interaction with the receptor and be brought into the cells of interest.
Great, thank you so much. Any additional comment for what we're learning from Barry and Jeff, or anything to add?
No, I mean, I'm completely aligned with how they view this. Yeah.
Maybe I can shift the gear towards about how gene therapy being administered, right? Maybe Jeff, can you share your thought about what are the key consideration or the challenge you have perceived gene therapy to be used in treating the Pompe disease?
Yeah, happy to. So, we at Avro are developing lentiviral gene therapy for 5 or 6 different lysosomal disorders. And so when we look at Pompe, we can't help ourselves but to try to compare and contrast what is the same and what is different, just because of who we are and how we spend our day. But of course, starting with a target product profile to sort of clarify what we're trying to achieve on the most high level, like all of us, we're trying to provide this long-term, durable, maybe even lifetime response with a single infusion. But when we look at Pompe specifically, it to us is the most challenging of the lysosomal disorders that we're targeting. And again, comparing and contrasting, just starting with there are 3 challenges that I think have a higher bar with Pompe. First of all, we feel we need 20 to 40 times as much enzyme in the ERT world as a dose. So very high levels of systemic distribution relative to, for example, Fabry disease or Gaucher disease, some others that we focus on. So that's one hurdle. But the second thing, as has been mentioned, is we really need to impact the muscle, including pulmonary, respiratory, in a meaningful way. And then thirdly, and this, we've learned from Professor Byrne and others about how important the brain and the spinal cord is, and that this is a brain and spinal cord disease. So we need to have that global CNS effect, motor function, cognitive impairment. So that's the starting point, is that our lentiviral gene therapy, but with these extra hurdles. And in our preclinical models, what we demonstrated to ourselves, at least, was that our standard sort of off-the-shelf ex vivo lenti gene therapy met some of those hurdles, but not all of them. And so that caused us to think about what needed to be engineered or addressed differently. And we really have tried to focus on a 3-pronged solution, which is, number one, to generate that systemic expression in a prolific way, meaning higher levels of enzyme than our other disease targets, primarily via a more potent promoter, but some other approaches as well. And then number 2, to incorporate a lysosomal uptake tag, a GILT tag, that many would be aware of its early use in BioMarin, because we felt that this has already been shown to increase uptake in the muscle 25-fold. So this sort of 1-2 punch of lenti gene therapy plus the GILT tag, but also to combine our gene therapy with busulfan conditioning to facilitate engraftment of the corrected cells, not only in the bone marrow, but also in the microglia compartment. And so we felt with this, 3-pronged approach of, a more aggressive promoter, GILT tag, combining with busulfan conditioning, we could ideally, this is aspirational, all we've demonstrated is great efficacy in Pompe disease mice models, but that we would hope to be able to check those 3 boxes of systemic distribution that's more prolific, targeting muscle, targeting brain. So that's where we are now. We've completed our preclinical work and look forward to, testing it. Now, our first focus area will be classic infantile onset Pompe, and that was reflective in our preclinical studies. But of course, that's an area of very high unmet need. So we'll be interested to see whether or not the technology translates from preclinical, from animal to human.
Yep, thank you. You probably know this question coming to you, right? AAV delivering vehicle has some limitation, and you're such experience and you know so much about the lenti. Do you expecting the lenti delivery can circumvent some of the AAV-based kind of gene delivery?
Well, I do, because I think for fair balance, they each have their strengths and they each have their weaknesses, and I think they're different, right? So,
yep.
For fair balance, I don't, before I talk about some of the strengths of lenti, I think that the challenges primarily can be drilled down to it's a complex personalized therapy. We modify the patient's own stem cells outside the body and then reinfuse. So there's a complexity that doesn't exist with AAV. And then there's the tolerability of the conditioning approach, which we're working hard to minimize, but it's an aspect of the therapy. So those are our challenges, but I guess the challenges related to liver toxicity or immunogenicity are not seen to date in lenti. And I think that some of the benefits of using this personalized approach, complex as it is we're not having to address things like neutralizing antibodies to the AAV itself, and even to the enzyme. I think that there's been early data in diseases like Hurler's and in our own Fabry program that the enzyme, that the procedure itself may tolerize the patient to the enzyme. And so, and I think in terms of directed uptake, we just have a completely different approach, for better or for worse, is that, the primary mechanism is that we transduce billions of leukocytes, which both manufacture and distribute protein. So some of that distribution, for example, a transduced macrophage would home to inflammation. And ideally, if our drug is working properly, these messengers will be carrying enzyme throughout the body, head to toe, and that's what we're aiming to address. And then, of course, there are manufacturing complexities on both sides for AAV and for lenti. They just happen to be different. Is that in our world, a large bioreactor would be 200 liter, where we can manufacture in a single run enough to treat 40 to 50 patients in a 200 liter serum-free suspension bioreactor today. So, in the rare disease world, that should be enough to treat thousands of patients a year. And then we've invested very heavily in automated manufacturing. So now we're up and running on 3 continents to be able to manufacture in what is called the Miltenyi Prodigy system that we've customized for gene therapy. So none of that is easy, but I think that the manufacturing on both sides of that ledger still are a work in progress.
Fantastic. Any thought, Barry, about comparing AAV and the lenti, the pro and con? Oh, Barry, I think you are silent, Barry.
Excuse me. So yes, as Jeff mentioned, the fundamental difference is whether these genomes are stably incorporated into hematopoietic stem cells or episomally delivered directly to the target tissues, whether they're lower motor neurons or muscle cells, and there may be benefits from either approach. They is exactly as you said. They have strengths and weaknesses. In the focus on early onset Pompe and recognizing the fact that AAV vectors are resident episomally in the cells, a lot of our focus has been on dispelling a conventional wisdom that AAV delivery is a one-time delivery strategy. And so we've spent the last several years establishing the basis for readministering AAV vectors so that there can be sustained effects over the lifespan, because right now in the US, about half of children with Pompe are diagnosed as newborns. That will continue to increase over the coming years. And so we will then have to make a decision, even whether they're early onset or late onset diseases, when and how to intervene to try to optimize outcome. So the paradigm is really changing. Since we implemented newborn screening in Florida, where we have about 250,000 births a year, we've had identified 5 patients with Pompe disease and all late onset. And so that's a very challenging discussion with the families, and they are the only comfort they derive from, what they might tumble to thinking is a devastating situation for that newborn, is that there are options like these that are being discussed today available. And that in fact, they will hopefully have many options. So this is, there are some fundamental differences, but in the end of the day, the goal is to try to provide the best, most effective therapy for all patients, young and old. And not just the existing patient population, but those that are being identified really early, where there's probably an even better chance to have a long-term impact.
Any additional thought, Ed, from what you heard from Barry and Jeff?
Yeah, I would echo the comments of Barry. I mean, I think, there used to be a pretty clear distinction between gene editing and gene therapy approaches. And retreatment was one of the things that was, seen for a long time as, very distinct between those two. And I think those lines are blurring. I think what, Barry's group has done has been phenomenal. There's been a lot of research, generally speaking, understanding from an immunologic perspective, how can we potentially retreat, or even with both of these approaches, there may be immune aspects of initial administration that we aren't yet aware of. But I think that's something that the field is learning very rapidly. And so I would also echo Barry's sentiment. From my perspective, the most exciting thing is that so many companies are working on treatments and utilizing a lot of different approaches to do that. I hope that they're all successful, and I know that even those that aren't successful, we're going to learn, and it's going to help advance the science of the disease.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ed. Yeah, maybe Barry, along the lines of thought you brought up about the timing of the treatment, right? So do you think there's a optimal timing for the gene therapy to be administered is really most efficacious for the Pompe disease?
Well, we do know from the experience that early interventions will matter. That experience is growing in the U.S. as well, although we don't have as long term follow-up but the opportunity to identify patients early will help the community of providers establish better natural history data, identify other both imaging and molecular biomarkers of disease severity that can be a guide to when there are critical changes. Make an analogy to some of the work that's been done by the group at our institution to understand natural history in Duchenne muscular dystrophy by utilization of an MRI imaging biomarker. So the Imaging Neuromuscular Disease group and has incorporated some of those ideas into work being done by Jordi Diaz in the Pompe community. And so similar observations that there may be some predictive biomarkers that would be used to guide treatment.
Maybe I would another question directed to Ed, right? So what do you think the current challenging of the gene therapy in the Pompe disease from your the drug development side, that point of view? Any challenge you can share with us?
Yeah, I think the challenges are on one hand a good one. I think with the data that we've seen coming out recently at the World LDN meeting, that the bar is being moved for what available therapies are able to accomplish. And at least for where we are now, and this will obviously be solvable, most of the patients who will be treated with a background of enzyme replacement therapy, and whether that's, traditional enzyme replacement therapy or as it develops remains to be seen. And so I think going then to what Barry said regarding endpoint development, it can be difficult to discern the effects of your gene therapy with an overlay of a patient who's already on enzyme replacement therapy. And so I think a lot of the studies you'll see will have randomized withdrawal of patients or withdrawal of patients if it appears to be safe. And again, that just means that the amount of time it takes to determine if an approach is successful or not might be somewhat delayed. I think the other way of looking at that question is also with regards to the DMD community and the MRI measurements. I remember being on a panel pre-COVID for hemophilia and someone asking why so many companies are doing hemophilia gene therapy. And the answer is because from a drug development standpoint, to have a blood biomarker that's tied, so one-to-one with bleeding risk and with the need for, with the need for therapy, that it's very easy is the wrong word, but you can determine whether you're having an effect or not relatively early in the course after you've administered the drug. And I think that's where I give a lot of credit to the DMD patient advocacy community. I think they've done a lot of that work, understanding what are the risk factors and what the risk factors, how that predicts how endpoints in terms of muscle strength will progress over time. With Pompe, there are of course the standard assessments that we look at, like 6-minute walk, like forced vital capacity in an adult patient or in an adult patient group, for example. But I think that's where the field will head, is that we'll have both objective as well as patient-reported outcome measures that really do help us discern, are these drugs working or not? Because, as was said before, so many people are working in the field, which is great. And we need to, in a systematic way, to be able to determine, okay, this works, let's move forward with this, or this doesn't work, so let's try something else. I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned, for example, from the field of oncology, where they look at development in a very rational way. Now, again, they are able to, do scans and look at how much the tumor has grown or not grown. But I think with regard to radiographic measurements, I think with regards to biomarkers, whether it's in the blood or the urine, the field is progressing where you will be able to get an earlier readout about these therapies and whether or not they are successful.
Any additional comment, Barry, Jeff?
Yeah, I think despite the pandemic, we were able to complete through the Muscular Dystrophy Association the patient-focused drug development activity that has led to a voice of the patient statement that really should be guidance for everyone developing drugs in the Pompe patient community. And one thing that comes across loud and clear from patients is that existing therapies still leave some room for improvement because of the fatigue that patients face. And this is debilitating for many individuals because it's hard to really live your life under those circumstances. So that should be part of our guidance as to whether these are detailed Pompe specific quality of life measures or focused on a fatigue rating scale. we may be able to find that alternative therapies actually impact that aspect, and one would expect it to, in fact, because when you look at the through the Pompe registry, we actually over many years and about 1,600 patients assessed rate of change in some key domains, and on treatment, there is still a negative trajectory in some key outcome measures. So if an alternative advanced therapy, whether it's lentiviral mediated gene therapy or LOPD, muscle-directed gene therapy, or systemic gene therapy in IOPD, you would hope to see a positive change in some of these key outcome measures and not just a reduction in the rate of decline in patients. And I think that's what the patient community is now expecting and should expect from a successful treatment strategy.
Fantastic. Any additional thought to add, Jeff?
I mean, I think that encapsulates it. Maybe just to agree, I mean, one thing that we found interesting in this field is, when we've done focus groups and research to try to really understand the needs, if you have two columns, what the physicians characterize as the needs in ranked order, and the patients, the clinicians are often focused on end organ damage and others. So we really do need to, target and measure the quality of life aspects.
Thank you. I think with the interest of time, I probably concluding with this the final question, right? I think we have seen a lot of increasing progress in collaboration among the drug developer, patient, and doctor to advance the treatment, especially the gene therapy to treating Pompe disease, right? So from the drug product perspective, right, do you see any major gap that still need to be addressed now or in the next decade? Maybe I can direct this question first to Jeff. Would you mind to comment on that?
Well, so I think it's one of the challenges in designing trials is that you have to sort of placate many masters, and the FDA is the one that probably is the least flexible in terms of meeting those needs. So I think we're always trying to understand, first of all, what is the primary endpoint that is regulatory mandated. But beyond that, we'll have greater flexibility in the secondary endpoints or the exploratory endpoints, where we can do a much better job in really connecting with the patient community and understanding what are the things that are really important to the community to properly measure.
Any thought add on the same question?
Yeah, I would very much echo Jeff's thoughts. I think one of the things that we tend to approach drug development in the way that we've always known it for Pompe, but I think one of the things that we need to be open to is, as these treatments roll out and as patients hopefully respond to them, I think thinking about the way that we look at responses. I think the fatigue response, the fatigue example is a great one, but I think these have the potential to be transformative therapies. And so understanding and picking up on those signals early, I think, and sharing that information, I think will be very helpful, because, oftentimes the scales are adjusted to, in some cases, measure incremental benefit. And if you're seeing more than just incremental benefit, then you need a scale to be able to understand the magnitude of that effect. And so, I think it's upon all of us to make sure that we're monitoring that, and then coming back to the scientific community saying, hey, maybe there is a better way to measure this.
Barry?
Well, one part of my life is in the more basic science aspects. So we've tried to facilitate expediting the drug development timeline through establishing non-clinical models that I think are an aspect of the pre-competitive space that maybe you're alluding to, where we can share, both to the scientific community trying to understand mechanism and to drug developers to help de-risk clinical studies so they're not iterative in humans, but rather you have put your best foot forward when you responsibly use representative animal models. So we've, in our initial collaboration with Nina Rabin, the full knockout model, we've established 2 other conditional knockouts as well as 2 rat models that recapitulate the early and late onset disease, as well as the naturally occurring canine model, which has been informative and by understanding its natural history. So, that if that helps the overall scientific community and helps the patient community, then I feel like we've done our part to help expedite the drug development path for this area. So that's been rewarding.
How would you see the gene therapy evolve for Pompe disease treatment, right, in your estimation for the next decade or so? What's your crystal ball tell you? Maybe Jeff, what's your thought?
I mean, I think the great situation that we're in is that there are multiple approaches. So, you know, we don't need everything to work. We need something to work. And after years and decades of research, they're all either in the clinic or approaching the clinic. So, you know, I think we're going to do an awful lot of learning in the next handful of years about, you know, the pros and cons of the various approaches. And, you know, it might be that it's not a one size fits all, that there's different segments of the population that are better suited for various approaches. But I think the exciting thing is there's just so many energy units being applied to this very important indication that we just have to hope that, you know, it translates. But it's been a long wait, and hopefully we'll be getting some pretty exciting answers very soon.
Great. And Ed, any thought?
Yeah, that resonated a lot with me. I mean, I think it's at conferences like this, sharing the information, making sure that everyone is, you know, as Barry was talking about earlier, you know, making sure that we're doing as much information sharing as possible. And, you know, as was said, there may not be a one size fits all approach, but again, learning from that and then iterating upon it, I think is going to be very helpful.
Barry?
So you asked for the crystal ball. I wish I had one, but I do think that providing options to patients is going to elevate their expectations and hope of improved quality of life. And but it is challenging in an era where we have to focus first on safety. This for better, worse does slow the process. And there's new guidance now from the agency on guidelines for in neuromuscular diseases, and there are important improvements anticipated in the critical quality attributes of the gene therapy agents that are being used in many of these programs across the disease spectrum. So, you know, it will be incumbent then on industry where the therapies have to come from to be durable, right? We need our industry partners to help develop these drugs in a way that they'll be available for all time in the future to new patients identified with Pompe. So we just have to meet that standard and make sure that we have safety first and that we reliably demonstrate that they're effective and durable.
Thank you, Barry. I really interest of time. Any final thought? Ed, Barry, Jeff, Jeff, maybe.
I mean, really, just a quick thank you. It's a real treat to actually get to talk about this issue with some of the real leaders in the field. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Ed?
Yeah. Again, thank you. It was an honor to speak on this panel. Really, really enjoyed it, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, David. Thank you, Wuxi. And we hope this is informative to the people who participate and see and learn about from this in the future. So we appreciate it.
First of all, thank you for being participating in this panel discussion. I personally have learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will just learn as much as I do and feel exciting, not only for the promising current status, but even encouraging for the future. I thank you for your great work you have done for the Pompe Society, right? I know those unmet medical need patients are waiting for us. I will be cheering for you. I will try to contribute from my part to making this breakthrough therapy, either using traditional enzyme replacement therapy or the gene therapy that's dear in my heart to work eventually with transforming the patients their current life. So thank you so much for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry, Ed, Jeff, and David, for inspiring discussion on the potential of new technologies and new modalities. We have a lot to look forward to. From today's discussion, we also come to understand there is still so much work ahead of us to support the Pompe patients and the 300 million people worldwide suffering from rare diseases. At the WuXi AppTec, we believe in a future where every drug can be made and every disease can be treated. And that future is only possible if we all work closely together. And this brings us to the conclusion of today's event. We would like to thank our speakers for sharing your wonderful work and deep insight. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Together, we can harness the tremendous potential of science and collaborations in advancing medical breakthroughs for patients. Thank you, and see you next time.